Hello everyone and welcome back to the Internet Report, where we uncover what's working and what's breaking on the internet, and why. This week we're discussing recent outages at Starlink and Schwab. We'll also look at the recent DDoS attack that impacted the Internet Archive. I'm Barry Collins and I'll be hosting today with the amazing Mike Hicks, Principal Solutions Analyst at Cisco Thousand Eyes. As always, we've included chapters in the episode description below, so you can skip ahead to the sections that are most interesting to you. And if you haven't already, we'd love you to take a moment to like and subscribe. And for all our YouTube listeners, don't forget that we also release this show on all the major podcast platforms, so feel free to give us a follow over at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen. On with the show, and I started by asking Mike to explain what happened at Starlink.
Approximately 1:25 a.m, that's UTC time, on Wednesday, May 29th, Starlink actually experienced one of its longest global outages in recent memory. So, we haven't had sort of many significant outages for a long time. The outage itself lasted around 45 minutes. What we actually observed from a Thousand Eyes perspective was globally, users connecting to the system, we actually couldn't sort of get into the internet. So you could actually connect in, you could actually go to the Starlink service itself. But then getting out or breaking out from that onto the internet itself, you couldn't connect any further. You were sort of getting DNS failures. There was sort of no pass available, even though everything looked to be up and going. So again, I can make my connection into my system, but then to break out into the internet, essentially break out of the Starlink network into something else, was where I was hitting that failure.
When users can't reach the broader internet, the issue is often attributed to a DNS failure. However, as Mike explains, this wasn't the case here, even though users were experiencing what seemed to be DNS problems.
So when we see things like that, what we're actually talking about is essentially we're looking at Starlink as an ISP network. So if I think about sort of all my resolutions I can do with there, so the first thing that occurs is I do my DNS resolution, I do my lookup. So I'm actually doing that and I'm asking the question, and there's DNS servers within my environment, so I can actually sort of forward that request on and get the information coming back. So the minute I need to go out is when I need to sort of break out of that Starlink network, break out of that ISP networks. So if I can't resolve a name of that first instance, what it actually then manifests, and this is what we were seeing, was it actually sort of shows up as DNS issues. So, you've failed to make that connection. So I have, if I go back to the OSI 7-layer model, so my physical, my data, my network, my session, and so on, up to the application level there. What I'm actually doing, I have my physical, I have my data, and it's when I'm actually sort of trying to resolve at that network level, I can't do it. So I actually have that physical connection, but I can't go on there. So this is why then it manifests itself as DNS issues, because essentially I can't go out. Doesn't necessarily mean it was a DNS fault per se, but this is how it sort of showed up.
When ISPs suffer what appears to be a DNS failure, the advice is to switch DNS providers to something like Google's free DNS. But since Starlink's issues weren't specifically DNS, that wouldn't have provided a workaround here. Can you unpack that a bit more, Mike?
Yeah, so again, as we're sort of saying, we're looking at this contained network. So as you say, one thing is I might change to Google's DNS service. So I sort of change my default DNS service to point out to that. But I still then need to actually sort of break out to get to that network. This isn't part of Starlink's network. So therefore, I need to forward that information on. But where it appears, if it is a failure at a DNS level, i.e. my DNS server is failing to resolve the names, or my DNS service can do that, changing it does work. But in this case, it wasn't at that fundamental DNS level, that foundational DNS level. It was more around the actual network connectivity itself. So I couldn't even get to 1.1.1. But then that's how it manifests itself coming back as looking at it from a DNS perspective. The thing about this is there is all these sort of workarounds, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, where what you need to do is to correlate those signals together. So the first thing I see this DNS issue. I then need to look, okay, what else is happening? Where am I actually resolving that name? It may be that actually sort of logging onto the system itself, you can say, what I've gone to an internal Class C address, and that it clearly isn't the right DNS server. So then I might want to put in the Google's one, override what the ISP is telling me and put that in and see if that makes a difference. I could even do things like typing in the IP address into the browser and see what steps I can actually do. But by being able to align all those together, by looking at those signals, collectively, it's where you're going to see. So this is, where we're talking about this concept of having all the lights are on green, and and if I look at all these things in isolation, everything's working. It's only when I put these things together, these multiple signals, that I start to have the impact that we're sort of seeing here.
Given that Starlink is often used by people or businesses that have limited access in the first place, Does a Starlink outage have bigger impacts than, say, a fibre provider going down?
I'm going to give you like a consultant answer here. It depends, because it really depends on how it's covered. I run Starlink here out of my office. So I've got a Starlink and I actually then have another ISP service. And what I've actually done is split my traffic across these two. So in my instance, it's not such an issue. And the reason I do that is because of the characteristics of the application. So some work better over different systems. So effectively, I can bundle the bandwidth and sort of get the best out of both by having these diverse routes. Now, if I'm considering something like, so there is some remote mine sites here, particularly in Australia, where the only way they can have connectivity into that environment is with a satellite service, be that a GEO service or a LEO service like Starlink. So if they lose that, that's a problem. Is it a greater problem than if I was actually having a fibre cut? Potentially, because of the way I actually make my connectivity coming in. The other thing I should reiterate about this is sort of the first major global outage we've seen on the Starlink for some time. It is actually pretty stable, and because of the whole cluster stuff they've got up there, and the amount of LEO, low Earth orbital satellites they have running around in those clusters there, connectivity is pretty good. And it does a pretty good job of actually connecting these stuff from these remote environments where there is no alternatives. So it's quite resilient itself. But if I'm thinking about a fibre cut, unless I'm actually back in that last mile, I'm not going to be impacted. I can actually route around it. There's other ISPs.
When connection redundancy isn't possible, businesses have to plan carefully for the occasional but inevitable outage. Mike returns to the example of the remote mining company he mentioned earlier.
I need to be able to run in this situation where I will have a failure at some point. It might not be a global failure, but it might just impact my local area there. So I need to take steps that I can be totally self-sufficient. And when we're thinking about it from a mining perspective, that means that I need to be able to run all my autonomous vehicles, all my autonomous drills, all that type of stuff, but also more importantly, all my health and safety stuff at that location. So if I can't have any diverse routes in there, I can't have these plans in place, then what I do is I make sure that I'm able to have my services so they can sort of be run offline. Now, we see this, for example, on the emergency services calls. Across a lot of countries, it's legislated that if you're coming across a Wi-Fi connection there, that the ISP must provide some sort of connection. They can't go down. You have to sort of maintain this connectivity. All those sort of things need to be taken into consideration.
Charles Schwab traders may have struggled to get into their accounts on June 11th. Mike explains what happened here.
What happened was access to the online app-based services at Charles Schwab, such as the Think or Swim trading app, became impacted. And what happened was it was actually sort of built around authentication issues, or that's what it appears to be, authentication issues. So users reported they were unable to log in or authenticate. And what occurred then was you could actually get to that front door, you could actually you could load the page, but when you actually tried to authenticate to log on to the system, you're actually getting sort of error message coming back. Now, the firm sort of acknowledged the issues on its homepage. They said sort of due to a technical issue, some of the clients may have difficulty logging onto it, and some of the platforms they stated there. They then came back later on and said it had actually been resolved. But if there was some users still experiencing issues, then they actually gave instructions on what to do. So again, we're sort of talking about this ability to be able to connect to the front end. Because we're talking from an application perspective, what this meant was that it had this sort of wide scale impact. So, multiple services are running there. Sort of anything that was used as authentication system to get on. So this could have actually come down to the mobile apps, obviously from a browser perspective as well. And anything they wanted to do in that back end, such as sort of making trades or things like that, had the potential to be impacted because I couldn't access the system.
When users were struggling to get back into their accounts after the issue was reported as fixed, Charles Schwab recommended re-logging into accounts or disabling and re-enabling biometric authentication. What does that tell you about the problem, Mike?
So we talked about in the past having these sort of footprints or these breadcrumbs, as it were, to sort of tell us what's going on. Now, if you think about how you authenticate to a system, there's this sort of two-factor authentication. So if I'm actually coming in through my phone, I have my sort of biometric authentication, sort of your Face ID. I've actually made the mistake of making a face when I did mine, which means I have to pull that face every time. So it's all these various methods, then you sort of do this two-factor authentication process on. When we think about how we sort of authenticate, obviously we have the login password to actually do that, but then these are protected by, say, these two-factor authentication systems. The fact then we had to sort of reinstall this or re-enable those who turn off face recognition and turn it back on again, which essentially sort of refreshes for that, implies that there is some sort of mismatch or potential mismatch in that sort of data. So we have this discrepancy where we're going on. So it's not just we couldn't authenticate your login details. What we couldn't then do was we couldn't confirm your identity because there's this sort of mismatch between, which is essentially what two-factor authentication is doing. It's providing that zero trust. Can you authenticate who you are by some other means around doing that? The fact then that they had to reinstall this implies that maybe some corruption or maybe some mismatch was occurring between there. So you effectively had to reset it. So everything then became aligned again.
The Internet Archive was a victim of a distributed denial of service attack in late May. Tell us what happened here, Mike.
So let's start off with a denial of service or distributed denial of service, a DDoS attack. These sort of malicious attacks that involve exploiting networks, compromised devices, sort of flood and render a target, server, or network inaccessible. And really what it means is I'm going to send lots of traffic to that and make that system busy. Particularly in this environment, within the Internet Archives environment there, they were hosted in a single location, which meant then when this is actually targeted, it meant that sort of you couldn't actually get to the archives themselves. You actually couldn't get to the system because it was essentially busy. We're sort of blocked with all this traffic, we can't get in. And then you start to sort of see timeouts, loss rate, and these types of things occurring when we're trying to make that connection.
How can an organisation defend itself against a DDoS attack?
So there's multiple services out there. We talk about DDoS mitigation services, which essentially detect this traffic coming on and they sort of take it through a scrubbing site, redirect the traffic, and essentially sort of black hole that traffic to protect the main one. But obviously, a very simple way to do this, and I sort of mentioned this up front, is that when we talk about the Internet Archive, they were talking about a single location where their system was, which meant we could sort of target that. If I have a distributed architecture, so I'm sort of dealing with lots of environments, it becomes harder to actually sort of target that system. And again, then through the use of sort of the DDoS mitigation services from different providers there, I can intercept that traffic and then sort of distribute it to other areas. Sort of, like I said, put it to scrubbing sites, black hole it, get rid of that traffic itself. Now, in some cases, this can sort of cause disruption, i.e. people can't get to my site, but you're protected that time, depending on the nature of the attack. But when I have this large scale distributed, effectively, I'm just sort of black hole into one area. And then because I have my distributed environment, I can still maintain connectivity. So from my user's perspective, they're not noticing anything, while at the same time, I'm siphoning off this traffic to somewhere else where it's actually checked and sort of see what's going on there. We've also then got to think about who my users are. And so it comes back into this, what steps can we actually take to do that? What steps do we need to take? What actions do we need to take to sort of protect that? And there is this risk and reward type of scenario in place. What if we're actually offline? How much is that going to impact our revenue? And as we've talked about for some of the outages, there is a legitimate reason is to do nothing. Now, in an outage situation, I might say, I know the power's coming back on in 30 minutes. It's quicker for me it's more simple for us to wait for that power to be restored than to actually pick up and move to our disaster recovery site. And if you actually read through what the Internet Archive put out, they said this has been an increase in sort of these types of attacks on libraries and these types of facilities themselves. So it's not they weren't aware of it. And they identified what was going on and they sort of, took steps to do that. But again, in this situation, it may well have been easier for them just to say, right, this is the best course of action for us, rather than investing all this money to sort of do this whole distributed stuff and go down that path there.
Finally, on this week's show, it's time to take our regular look at the overall outage trends. What have we seen over the past month, Mike?
Global outages showed a brief increase in mid-May and then this sort of returned to this downward trend. So if you remember coming out of April, we actually sort of saw this downward trend to the back end of April and that sort of continued there. So from May 20 to 26, there was an 11% decrease in outages compared to the previous week and a 14% decrease from May 27th to June the 2nd. Then at the start of June, the outages increased by 40%, but then decreased by 6% from June 10th to 16th. So we sort of see this sort of trend coming back down again. So it's this slight rise and then sort of decrease again from there. Then if we look at the United States, they experienced fluctuations in outages with a 25% decrease, which was followed by a 14% decrease, then increases of 14% and 6% in the subsequent weeks. Now, if you look at that from a US perspective, the US-centric outages represented 32 to 40% of all global outages during this period. So if you actually look at that first period, so that May 20 to June the 2nd, we actually saw 32%.
This is the third consecutive fortnight where US-centric outages have represented less than 40% of all observed outages. That's the first time this year we've seen that happen.
But then that second period, so then we went from June the 3rd to June the 16th, then it went back up to 40%, so 40% of all the global outages.
And looking at the month-over-month data, in terms of the total number of global outages, how did May compare to April?
So if we actually look at May, there were a total of 882 outages worldwide, and this was a 28% increase from the previous month. And the United States was slightly different with this, where we saw a 4% decrease in outages.
We're heading into the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Is that going to have any impact on the figures, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And if we actually look back on previous years, we kind of see a bit of a staggered approach. So if we actually take sort of the European stuff, we start to see sort of their outages. They started to peter off, but they peter off slower than the US outages. When we're talking about these outages, we're still going to see the situations where something's misconfigured or there's a break, there's a failure, and we have an outage occurring there. When I'm talking about these numbers petering off, I'm talking about the likes of scheduled maintenance or planned expansion work. So that's what I've seen in previous years. And it'll be interesting to see if this happens this year as well, is we start to see sort of the European numbers, as it were, or outages are more European-centric, dropping to start with. And then the US ones sort of kick in a little bit later on. We sort of get into towards that July period where a lot of the holidays are taken.
That's our show. Please like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. And not only does this ensure you're in the know when a new episode's published, it also helps us to shape the show for you. You can follow us on X at @thousandeyes or send questions or feedback to internetreport@thousandeyes.com. Until next time, goodbye.